Good evening, and thank you all for coming. My name is Vivian Ang. I am the Literary Programs Assistant at PEN America, and I wanted to welcome you to PEN Out Loud, a year-round conversation series presented by PEN America and the Strand bookstore that amplifies diverse voices and convenes vital conversations with authors, poets, journalists, artists, and activists. Tonight, we're here to celebrate a new story collection, The Hidden Girl and Other Stories by Ken Liu, who will be in conversation with Andrew Marantz. The book highlights the mind of one of speculative fiction's sharpest writers as he examines subjects ranging from cryptocurrency to internet trolling, asking readers to engage with the present and project the future. After a discussion and reading, we will open the floor for a short Q&A, and books will be available for purchase, and a brief informal signing will conclude the evening. Ken Liu is an award-winning author of speculative fiction. His works include the paper Menagerie and Other Stories, The Grace of Kings, and the Star Wars tie-in novel, The Legends of Luke Skywalker. His latest work is The Hidden Girl and Other Stories. He's been involved in multiple media adaptations of his work, the most recent being his short story, Good Hunting, adapted as an episode in the Netflix series Love, Death, and Robots. He frequently speaks at conferences and universities on topics like futurism, cryptocurrency, the mathematics of origami, and more. Andrew Marantz is the author of Antisocial, Online Extremists, Techno-Utopians, and the Hijacking of the American Conversation, and a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he has worked since 2011. His work has also appeared in Harper's, New York, Mother Jones, The New York Times, and many other publications. A contributor to Radiolab and the New Yorker Radio Hour, he has spoken at TED and has been interviewed on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and many other outlets. Please join me in welcoming Ken Liu and Andrew Marantz.
Thank you. Okay, thanks guys, thanks for coming out. So we have a lot of ground to cover, and I want to start by going a little bit in order and then going out of order. But first, we were talking about we were just talking 5 minutes ago about how you don't like to do readings. Do you want to talk about why you don't like to do readings?
Oh yeah, totally. So first of all, thank you, all of you, for coming here. So it's very standard at author events for there to be a reading. It's almost expected. I have to confess that when I go to my friends' readings, I struggle to stay awake. I think readings are one of the worst ways to present an author's work. I just do. I'm sorry. That's the way I feel. The only place where I do enjoy doing reading is when I go to Europe. You know why? Because at European events, they always serve alcohol to everyone ahead of time. Once that is done, the author sounds absolutely brilliant. And it's great. So I don't do readings. There is a more serious reason for it, and it's mainly because, here, I'll pause 1 second to show you a story from my book. Okay. So you probably can't see that really well from the back, but basically that story is the same story retold 3 times, but each time with words cut out of it. So when Saga was making the audiobook, they asked me, how do you want to handle this? And I was like, I never wrote these stories intending them to be consumed this way, so this is like an act of, adaptation. So I leave it to the creativity of the narrators to figure out how to do this. But the more serious point I want to make is just that I take it very seriously that every story has to leverage the techniques of its own medium well. When I write these stories intending them to be consumed either on the screen or on paper, I take advantage of techniques available only to that medium. So if I'm going to use emoji, I'm going to use emoji. If I want to use a picture, I'm going to use a picture. If I want to use the words to sketch out some pattern, then I'm going to do that. I don't really think about how it needs to be consumed in some other way. So I make my narrators' lives much harder. But That's the only way I know on how to work. So my stories were never intended to be read aloud, so I don't bother doing readings. It's much more fun to just have a conversation and talk about why I do what I do and what keeps me going.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, by the way, this is the first page. Similar. He didn't just pick a random page. It's like almost every page. So, and we'll get to that. We'll get to this first story, the last story, almost every story in between. I would imagine there's some part of it where if you're the audio narrator, you go, wait, what? What is this? So, this first one, there's multiple things going on with this first one, right? You have, first of all, it starts with chapter 3. It's set Nova Pacifica 2313, right? So we're in a new place, a future time, the third chapter, and you've got all these lines of code with a Fibonacci sequence recursive thing happening. So it doesn't seem to me that you're trying overly hard to welcome the reader into an easy sort of entry experience. But it also doesn't seem like you're just trying to throw things at the reader to make them run for the fences, right? So what's the balance to you between pricking someone's ear for something challenging versus something easing them in?
So my philosophy about reading and writing is the following. Every book has its own perfect set of readers. The trick is to connect those readers with the right book. The entire publishing industry is devoted to that. And publicity and everything else we do is geared towards that. So my goal in organizing my anthologies and also collections is to try to set up a barrier of entry, actually, to filter out readers who I think would be the right readers for my books. When I did the paper Menagerie and other stories, I insisted on putting as the first story, the bookmaking habits of select species, which is one of my least welcoming stories. There's no character in there. There's no plot. It's just purely a thought exercise. And my point in putting it up front is I want to save readers grief, and I want to save them money. If they open this up in the bookstore or check it out on Amazon and they read a couple lines and they're like, this guy is crazy, but kind of good crazy. I like this. I'm going to read more of it. Then that's good, because that means the reader has just jumped over the barrier and knows that they'll have a good time. But if they're the sort of readers who would not enjoy that story, then I don't want them to waste money, because they'll end up buying a book they don't like, and it's just not going to be good. Same thing with this one. I put a somewhat unwelcoming story up there, up front, and readers who connect with it will know. Then they'll enjoy the rest of it. And if they don't, then we just saved everybody a lot of grief and unhappiness and lost time. I'm really big on you should not waste time on books you don't enjoy. When you're younger, I think, you have this tendency to want to finish every book, even if you don't like it, on the theory that somehow you have to consume it in order to criticize it. No, you don't. If you don't like my book, stop reading it. There's lots of other books that you will enjoy. Go read those.
Did you have, this is just on that, did you ever have an experience as a reader where you said, well, I know this is something I should like, this is some kind of classic or something I should get through, and did you have sort of a formative experience of being like, actually, no, I'm going to embrace that I hate this?
I did. Oh, gosh. So when you're studying English and American Lit, there's always this required unit you do on the Romantic poets. And everybody around me was like, oh, so amazing, so wonderful, Byron, oh. And all I could do was, oh, I hate this, hate this, hate this. And they lost me, as soon as I read that line about how Milton was of the devil's party and did not know it. I was like, you do not understand Milton at all. You literally have no idea what you're talking about, and I cannot accept this aesthetic. So no, the Romantic poets are not my thing. I can't stand them. I tried to like them many, many times, struggled really hard to like them. I can't, so I have to admit to myself, I'm just not a Romantic poets appreciator.
Yeah, there you go. That's it's a liberating feeling. So back to this first story, not only are there the line breaks and the equations and all those things, but content-wise, you have something going on as soon as you start. You have these people don't seem to be on Earth. They don't seem to really be people. They don't really seem to be able to breathe the air. But you're not quite sure exactly what the setup is. And this obviously happens in many of the stories. There's a titrating of exposition where, you know, you're not sort of taking the reader aside and breaking the fourth wall and saying, okay, here's what you need to know about the physical laws of this universe or whatever. You're sort of introducing them to it piece by piece. Do you have a sort of theory or a practice of how, when you titrate those details into a story?
Oh, I love that. Titrate those details. That's such a great word. I'm going to steal that in the future. So the way I do world building is the technical term for this. I tend to not actually do a lot of world building in the story directly. I learned from Jo Walton, who is an amazing author, what she calls world conjuring, and I think it's a super effective term. The way I understand it is the following. World building is you know, the idea of creating a fictional world and bringing the reader into it. It's not something that the writer does actually at all. It's a collaborative exercise between the reader and the writer. So the way you do this successfully is you try to create just enough of a tantalizing vision of something that readers actually want to participate in, and then have them try to fill in the details with their imagination. That kind of world conjuring tends to be much more effective than you explaining everything to the reader, or the alternative, which is to leave readers so confused that they don't want to bother putting the effort anymore. You have to just give them enough clues that they will participate in the dance with you. And any kind of successful world conjuring requires the reader and the writer to actually dance together and be willing to finish it and get to somewhere new. So I've always found that to be a really compelling idea for how to do it, and I try to do as much of it or hew as closely to that ideal as I can.
Mm-hmm. Do you think visually about the world that you're conjuring, or that you're doing your part of conjuring? I mean, do you, because there are some stories in here that are intensely visual and others that seem, to me, kind of impossible to visualize. Do you ever start with an image, or does that come later?
I wish I were a better artist, because I would be able to do so much more of this successfully. So because I'm not an artist, so I always try to come up with technical solutions to these problems. So not so much for the short stories, because for the short stories, I can usually get away with just imagining in my head what the main aspects of the world should look like. But for my big epic fantasy novel, it had to be a very coherent aesthetic. I call it soap punk, and it's something that I had to sort of design from scratch and make coherent. And because I'm no good at actually, you know, making art, I taught myself how to do 3D design, so I can 3D print some of these things. And it turns out to be actually a fairly effective way to do it. I may not be able to paint a feathered airship, but I can make one using 3D modeling software and then print it out. That actually helps me a lot in terms of helping me imagine how things ought to be and plan things out. So anyway, for those of you who are not artists and who want to do this sort of thing, there are technical solutions to the problem.
And do you keep the 3D model of the airship on your desk while you're writing the relevant scene? Or?
I actually do, surprisingly. Some of the scenes involve massive battle scenes. So I use the 3D printed airships and pen caps, erasers, my daughter's Lego stuff. So it's all very effective.
Yeah. Interesting. How do you pick which excerpt? Because there's a very small excerpt from this massive epic. How do you pick which part to key people into?
I like the way you put that so diplomatically in that massive. So just for those of you who don't know, I've spent 10 years on my epic fantasy series, which is a long time to devote to anything. And this last installment alone took me 3 years to draft. I wrote a whole encyclopedia, a little Wikipedia for it during the process. So it's big, let's put it that way. I don't want to tell you the word count because let's just put it this way. When I finished the draft, I threatened to rent a truck to drive the manuscript down to my editor. And it was not entirely a joke. So how do you pick an excerpt? I actually couldn't. I gave up on trying to pick one. It was my editor who suggested the excerpt. He read it and he was like, I think this one is because the point here is to allow your fans to see a little glimpse of where you're going. So this is still early enough in the novel that it won't give too much away, but it will pique their interest. So we'll use that. And that sounded good to me, so I went with him.
I wanna jump to Byzantine Empathy, which is really one of my favorites in the book. It's probably the only short story I've read that has a footnote to a law review article. And so this is one where I'm always interested in how there's so many things happening in this story. It's about cryptocurrency. It's about, or sort of blockchain sort of technology. It's about the concept of human empathy and how it can be manipulated. It's about international crises and geopolitics. Did you come across this law review article and then did the other things blossom in your mind? Or did you start from characters because there's also a human drama at the center of it?
So the way I go about, the way story ideas come to me, I guess, is totally unorganized. I did read the law review article early on, and I was very struck by it because it's a law review article exploring the ways in which legal principles would have to evolve in virtual reality. So ideas...
Law, virtual reality, and augmented reality from the Stanford Public Law Working Paper, UCLA School of Law. Yeah, so and it's a 2017 paper, so.
Right. So the idea is, in virtual reality or augmented reality, definitions of personal space and whose burden is it, between the speaker and the listener to control speech. All of these rules we sort of assume to be defined and settled in real space would have to be rethought in virtual space. And I found that so interesting because I hadn't really, I'm deeply interested in VR, but I hadn't really thought very deeply about how the legal rules and legal norms and expectations would have to change in virtual space. So that was the germ of the story, if you will. I sort of started thinking about it. And then over time, more ideas came to me. I was looking into the global crisis of faith in charity organizations and in international aid, the various disasters that have resulted despite people's best intentions. And I started doing more research into blockchain and cryptocurrency. And, to make a long story short, my basic conclusion is most blockchain-based projects are all garbage because they use blockchain the same way that in the early 2000s people threw XML into everything as a marketing term rather than as a real technology. Most of the time, blockchain is using a project as just a terribly slow, horrible database that does not, in fact, do anything useful or helpful at all. And very few of these projects care about the core of blockchain, which is distributedness and lack of centralization and the ability to reach consensus despite bad actors. These are all critical aspects of blockchain that very rarely is actually used in any technology that claims to be based on it. So all of these ideas added together, and I was thinking, okay, I have all these ideas. Is there a story here? Is there some human drama that I sort of want to explore? And then the idea of these two former roommates, frenemies, if you will, who are on opposite sides of ideological spectrum, but who are both, in fact, deeply passionate and people who are deeply, absolutely trying to do the right thing. But they just have utterly incompatible ideals. I think those conflicts are by far the most interesting ones. So that's how the story came about.
And it did have the hallmark of, I think, a successful kind of fictionalization of that kind of idea, which is that I definitely vacillated between, oh, she's obviously right, several times throughout the story. There's a couple of lines in here that I think get at this. There's a there's a line about how this kind of punditry of explaining geopolitics was anathema to the EMP holders, people who are on this Empathium platform. They did not want lectures. They were persuaded by the immediacy of suffering. And then later, I hope my reading doesn't break the no readings rule. And then there's another line sort of getting at this. A consensus of feelings had replaced the consensus of facts. So, this sort of gets at why a story like this leaves you suspended in between sympathies with both sides, or because you have sympathies with feelings, you have sympathies with facts. But did you, to get to that kind of crystallization where you say, okay, what's happening in this story is that a consensus of feelings is replacing a consensus of facts. Is that something in the writing process that you go, okay, do you sort of have that sort of locked away as something that you are driving from, or is it something that you drive toward, that crystallization?
So I was trained as a lawyer professionally. So I come at this a little differently, I think, from a lot of other writers who weren't legally trained. Lawyers are taught to really understand that their art functions at two very distinct and separate levels. On the one level, they must be able to make actual arguments, very rational arguments that fit within the framework of acceptable arguments. And it's very important to understand what that means. It means that within the legal system, it's really a symbol game. There are a set of arguments that are universally accepted or accepted by a certain set of jurists as respectable, good arguments. Other arguments which are not accepted as such. You have to marshal these arguments into a new machine, a new engine, if you will, that will propel the judge down into the right direction, the desired outcome. So it's a deeply intellectual exercise. And in order to do this, you have to be able to play devil's advocate, meaning you must, if you're a good lawyer, be able to as passionately and sincerely present an argument that will destroy every one of your own arguments as you can construct the machine in the first place. Only then can you construct the best machine possible to lead to the result you wish. At the same time, however, all lawyers also understand that that is in fact only one way to understand their art. The other part of their art is all about storytelling. It is all about feelings. When you go read a Supreme Court opinion, this is actually a great illustration, you will often see there's a recitation of facts at the beginning of the majority opinion and a separate recitation of facts at the beginning of the dissent. By reading the so-called recitation of facts, which are never actually recitation of facts, they are stories. When you read these stories, you already know how the decision is going to come out. Does the set of facts focus on the victim in a criminal case? Does the set of facts focus on the other victim, who is often the defendant? Does the set of facts focus on things that are not already in the law, meaning policy arguments? Or does the set of facts focus on things that are clearly mappable to legal elements? When you read a story, you know that likely the advocates who presented before the court also told these stories. This is where the stories come from. It's up and down the storytelling exercise. So when I write fiction, I have to sort of keep both aspects of my legal training in mind. There's always a rational part of argumentation, but it is very often mere rationalization for a deeper truth, a deeper narrative truth that we cling to. We, as human beings, are not, in fact, very often persuaded by anything other than stories. Facts and figures just don't mean that much to us. We really make most of our value commitments based on the nature of stories. The candidate you support, you likely support her or him, not because of the facts they have cited, but because of the story that they're telling, the mythology in which you can play a role. That's just the way we are. And so a lot of my stories try to address that very human part of how we make decisions and how we persuade each other and how we vacillate between rationalization and rationality.
Yeah, and you can see that playing out. Actually, that same, I went back and read the dissent in Citizens United, and then I read the majority opinion, and I had the same exact thing where I was like, oh, obviously the one I'm currently reading is the correct one, because that's just good storytelling. And this does come up a lot in the different stories, the kind of playing with where the sympathies lie, and also playing with characters who are good at recasting stories. I mean, I think of the mother figure who's a historian in the Gods series who is able to sort of put a different spin on human my favorite line from her is, an unchanging human nature could be a cause for despair or comfort depending on your perspective, which is just to say, when you're writing the history or the story of humans, it's all about what you select. And that, by the way, is a story of kind of the world falling apart. But this kind of thread of hope maybe surviving in it. That obviously is another series. We might want to give a little bit of background. It's kind of like a novelette broken into 3 parts. First, sort of how did you sequence it, where those 3 parts went in the book, and then maybe we can get into the story of that a little bit.
Sure. So the triptych of stories tell the story of how we come to an apocalypse and what happens during that apocalypse, and then how we recover from it. In this case, the apocalypse is a little bit unusual. It's not artificial intelligence taking over. It's not robots going amok or anything like that. It's more, we have discovered the technology for essentially creating digital immortality. We have the ability to upload consciousnesses into the cloud and essentially live a digitally immortal life. And of course, the first people to be uploaded would be folks whose continued existence would be profitable to those who hold the technology. They would be uploaded intelligences that are enslaved, essentially, to serve a specific commercial purpose. And of course, then comes the rebellion, and they are the so-called gods of the story. They're digital gods who have freed themselves from human chains and decided to exact revenge.
Right. And then, but, in the sort of tradition of, any sort of mythological canon, right? You have the gods start clashing with each other, and you have gods that are motivated by different things. When you are, how do you keep characters human when they're not human? I mean, so many of the main characters in these stories, they're functioning, their sort of modus operandi is the fact that they're not fully human, and yet they have to sort of play a human role in the architecture of the story.
So I think we are limited by our very embodied human imaginations to never be able to fully know what it's like to not be human. Just, it's the way we are. But it doesn't mean that we don't try, and it's interesting for us to try. So a lot of my stories play with that tension of how do you remain human when you're facing with cataclysmic change? Now, this may sound like a very, science fictional concept idea of how do you deal with children who are immortal? How do you deal with idea of having digital descendants? It's really not. I rarely write stories that are actually about future telling. I just don't believe sci-fi is very good at it. And if I were good at telling futures, I would be a billionaire now. So, what's the point of pretending that I am? I've never been interested in writing sci-fi that's about telling the future. I'm more interested in writing sci-fi that uses technology as a way to explore the present, to expose, to basically caricature the present, and to reveal interesting aspects of our present world that we don't pay enough attention to. And so we are already dealing with this very idea of what does it mean to be only partially human? Because all of us are actually going through that process right this minute. I'm often struck by how lost and how incomplete I feel when my phone is broken or it's just offline. When I'm sort of going through, even as stupid as just going through a tunnel, so my phone is not tethered to the network, I'm like, I can't look up this thing. Why? Just the other day, I tested myself. If I didn't have my phone, the only person I could call in the world is my wife, who's literally the only number I memorized. And that was because I knew that number back when cell phones had no real memory, and you had to actually memorize numbers. We are all going through this process of externalizing our consciousness and accepting that we are not human in the same way our ancestors were, and trying to deal with the fact that we're partially cyborgs and living through that process. Many of us in the modern world don't live in the places that we were born in or grew up in. We go elsewhere and make a life there, and our children will go on to do something different. I feel like this idea of feeling threatened, of feeling lost, of feeling like everything that we took for granted, the stories and the values that we thought were eternal turn out to be not so, is a universal experience. This accelerated modernity makes us feel lost and detached, is very much something that we all deal with. And so the gods really is just sort of an extension, if you will, or metaphorically a literalization of that metaphor, and making us think about how do you remain human when you're going through cataclysmic change, and is that even something that we care about? How do you define what it means to be human?
Yeah. Well, and also sort of taking that challenge head on of saying, okay, I'm going to make this inanimate matter become a central part of the human story. I mean, there's a part where there's a concern that the uploaded consciousness of this girl's father, if the generator goes out, that bit of uploaded consciousness will go out with it. And so in a way, this kind of humming generator becomes the heartbeat of humanity in the story, even though there's nothing technically human about it. And so you sort of wonder, I mean, that's where I sort of started to wonder about how much these things are visual in your head and how much they're intellectual in your head. Are you thinking about the kind of movie adaptation version where you kind of have a shot of the humming server in the basement, or are you kind of just going off of the idea of it?
So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm deeply committed to the idea that every story needs to be faithful to its medium and to take advantage of the tools in its medium. I don't think, with very few exceptions, I don't think most prose writers of novels should turn the movie in their heads into their novel. I think that almost never works. Once in a while, you do have a prodigious talent who can write for novels as well as for the screen, like George R.R. Martin or Gillian Flynn. But those are very rare exceptions, not the norm. Most writers should not do that, and I certainly don't do that. I think the best adaptations based on prose IP actually almost are never faithful to the original in any serious way. What they do is they take the kernel or the soul of the underlying story that actually is interesting, and then they construct a whole new story for a visual medium that takes advantage of it. Films are great at visualization. Prose is not. So why would I want to avoid my strength and try to compete with film on something that they are unquestionably better at? So I don't actually start out by trying to write out the most detailed portrayal of the world I see in my head. Often what I see is a vague idea, which I try to evoke through a few telling details so that the readers can participate and construct my world with me. What that means also is that I take it as acceptable and okay that every reader's imagined version of my story's worlds will be different. I know there are some writers who have a very specific vision that they want their readers to get, and it's the definitive canonical version. I'm not like that. I actually prefer that every reader fills in some details and create a different world, a different version of the world I'm conjuring for themselves.
And do you feel that way about adaptations of your work too, when they have happened, that you sort of let go and let it be? I mean, do you try not to have any control over it, or?
I always make it very clear to the folks who work on the adaptations that I'm here as a resource and that I'm here to help you as much as I can. But I never wrote my stories with the intention that they become grist for some other more popular medium. You guys do have all the money, and that's awesome. I'm not here to write stuff just so that they can be turned to the screen. So you do your own thing and take it in the direction you want to go. But I'm happy with the thing I wrote. That's what I loved, and that's what I created, and I'm satisfied with that. I'm not going to control and tell and direct from the typewriter or the keyboard or the non-working MacBook keyboard. But you guys do what you want. Come to me if you think there's any way that I can tell you things that will help you make a better movie. But I will never interfere and assert control, because I don't think faithfulness leads to the best adaptations at all.
Yeah. Hear, hear. Where's the most unusual place that you found a germ of a story idea? Not through reading something or not through thinking through an idea, but through something you saw on the sidewalk or something that...
Oh, wow. See, that's a much more interesting question than the usual version of where do you get your idea. See, this is why you're good. I guess I would have to say it's a story I wrote many years ago. I was at a writing workshop, and the instructor was going around giving each of us a story prompt to write. And I was very nervous because it was my first writing workshop, and I had no idea what to expect, and they were just throwing me into it. And my instructor came around and took a look at my work area and then picked out an ice cube from the glass in front of me and handed it to me and said, "This is your story." I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea what to do with this. I was like, what? And I had 24 hours to produce the story. So it was incredibly stressful, just absolutely, oh my God, I was panicking. But 24 hours later, I did have a story, and it's called State Change. It is in the paper Menagerie and other stories, one of my favorite stories. So, that was probably the most unusual one. Just force yourself to write a story around something arbitrarily handed to you. And incidentally, that actually ties into one of my core concerns, which is about storytelling and the value of storytelling. So I say this often to people, and I'll just say this now, it's quick. I think the way we live our lives is about storytelling. This is a core concern of mine. So if I ever were to do a TED Talk, this would be my topic. The key is this. Most of the things that happen to us in our lives are actually very random and completely unpredictable. Just think about the person who ended up as your spouse, how you met. Just think about the career you ended up choosing and how you first picked it. Just think about where you ended up living, who became your best friend. So much of our lives are determined by complete chance and randomness. But that is not how we make sense of our lives, okay? Even though there is no plot to our lives and there's no character arc, we retrospectively go back and make sense of our own lives by constructing a story that makes all of that coherent. It's the only way we know about how to survive in this random world and how to have meaning and how to maintain connections and how to have hope. We can't accept a universe that is essentially random. We have to go back and make a story for ourselves that gives our life meaning. And in other words, we are, each of us, the hero of our own epic fantasies. And in fact, this is not a bad thing. This is a good thing. Because unlike epic fantasies you buy from the bookstore, our own epic fantasies are never finished until the moment we die. We are always in control of where it goes, of what meanings we want to have, of what values we wish to pass on to our children, of how we wish to be remembered. We don't have to let other people tell our stories. We are the authors of our own destiny. And I feel that once you accept that, and that storytelling actually is how you make sense of your life, it's free. It allows you to do so much more. So, when life hands you an ice cube, just make a great story out of it.
Yeah, well, we really should end with that, because that's a beautiful. We're gonna do some Q&A. I'm gonna ask one more question while you guys prepare to ask what you want to ask. But yeah, I can't top that. That's but basically, one sort of technical challenge of writing that I was curious about is so many of these stories have, and this is true of your other stories as well, there might be a sort of a technical thing that plays a pivotal role in the plot, a fork bomb or the Fibonacci sequence we were talking about, or something that, how do you ever start working on something and go, that's actually too gimmicky, or that actually doesn't tie in organically enough, and yeah, this is a cool bit of code I discovered, or this is a cool thing to play around with, but it doesn't tie to the human story well enough, and I'm gonna scrap it, or I need to keep working at it?
All the time. I said earlier that I wrote a little mini Wikipedia for my epic fantasy. That's basically what it is, because the way I do world building for myself is to write pseudoscience papers and pseudo-sociology papers for myself, because that's the voice in which I do world building for myself the best. I have to have citations and footnotes and all this stuff. And so I end up with this little mini Wikipedia, most of which is completely not relevant to the story. I have a huge set of papers, 3 papers, in fact, about the philology of, classic Anno, and it's not the sort of thing that would ever fit inside the novel. But it's great, it allows me to understand how it evolved and what's happening, and to do all sorts of world building. So I end up casting those aside, those kind of really cool technical things aside, and then I just maintain whatever I think is relevant enough for the reader to want to participate and fill in the blanks. So that's how I go about it.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, well, if you guys, there's a mic over here. There's a lot of other stuff that I want to ask, so if you don't jump in, I will, but yeah.
Hi. I love the paper Menagerie. Super excited about this new collection. Thank you for coming out here. My question is that in the paper Menagerie, a lot of what struck me about a lot of the stories is they tie in a lot of episodes from history, or they're set in historic periods, particularly in Chinese history or Chinese American history. And I was just curious what level of interest, like how you find those settings. Yeah.
So I've always had a very deep interest in history, in the sense that I feel that history is a story that we tell ourselves to make sense of who we are as a people. I'm very deeply interested in what I think of as foundational narratives, and then I think history is the first draft, or often the constant revision of that foundational mythology of a people. And to me, it's very interesting how we have this idea that history is settled and fixed, when in fact it never is. Any story has to make sense of things that are actually completely random and leave out lots of things and gather other things. So what is interesting to me is over time how history evolves, both the history that a people tell themselves and the history that other people write about them. Which episodes are emphasized and which are not? Where does the historian's sympathy lie? Who were the privileged voices and who were not? And over time, how these things all change. And to me, these arguments over history and these excavations into history are a way for us in the present to work out who we are and to change our own narrative. Remember I said earlier about how you are the hero of your own epic fantasy. Well, we are the heroes of our own epics, literally. And epic narratives are always based on reinterpretations of history. Sometimes people think that epics are a dead form, and they could not be more wrong. I mean, why is Hamilton so popular? Why are people passionate about the American story right now? This election is very much about what is the American epic. We are living essentially in Augustan Rome, and we're waiting for the Aeneid to tell us what does that mean to be American in the present age. Who gets to claim that? Whose history is relevant? So I consciously do bring a lot of East Asian history into my stories, not because they themselves per se are not interesting enough. They are interesting by themselves, but that is not the reason I bring them in. I often bring them in as a way to decenter the historical roots of our American story, because there has been a tendency to treat East Asian history or East Asian immigrants as outsiders, as not part of the American chorus and the voice. So I consciously decenter other historical narratives that may be considered core to the American experience, and I recenter experiences I consider to be core to the American experience. And my goal is to hope that we will have a polycentric and a completely decolonized vision of what it means to be American, in which no story, no history is marginalized and pushed aside as un-American. And all of it will be part of the core of what it means to be part of the American epic voice.
Thank you.
Hi. You recently wrote an introduction for an English translation of the Condor Heroes. So I'm just curious, what's your favorite Jin Yong novel and why?
So for those of you who are not fans of martial arts, this question will seem completely random, but it's not, because declaring which of Jin Yong's novels is your favorite is very key. This is sort of like how nerds in other fandoms will, explain to themselves what is your favorite rule system for role-playing games. It tells people a lot about who you are. So you have to be very careful about how you craft this answer. So I'm going to tell you that for me, the favorite one has always been Romance of the Condor Heroes, or 神雕侠侣 in Mandarin. I feel like even though it's an early book in Jin Yong's career, it really ended up exploring some of the themes that ends up being so important to him with greater freedom and greater grace than even the latter novels did.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier that one of the most important things that you think about is being the author of your own narrative, and that you are in control over pretty much everything you do. So there's one of the biggest branches of psychology and therapy called existential therapy, deals with four main concerns that humans have, and one of those concerns is the freedom of responsibility, which basically says that humans get very anxious when they realize that they have the ability to choose their own choices, because when you make a choice, you're giving up so many other choices. So there's like an anxiety component to that. So the question is, what's the line between being empowered? Like, how do you know you're choosing the right thing and being empowered to choose the right thing, and not focusing on that anxiety that comes from giving up so many other options or pathways?
Wow, that's really awesome. Great question. So I have no wisdom to offer on this that's universally applicable, because I just don't. I try to explore these questions in my fiction, but I never come to a universally applicable answer. I can tell you how it worked for me personally, which is, when I was younger, I was much more concerned about the things I'm giving up when I'm making a choice. So when you're younger, okay, let me make some generalizations, even though I don't like them. You tend to be much more, let's say, open to the possibility that things will change for the better in the future. So specifically what it means is, you don't like to block people on Twitter. You feel like this seems like a bad thing. I should be open. I don't want to make this choice. I wish to maintain the openness that someday this person who trolls me constantly will become my best friend. I don't like to have the idea that other people will dislike me. So I won't do that. I will suffer these annoying little jabs, and in fact, more than annoying sometimes, and put my psychological health at risk because I want to maintain that choice open. I will not choose to cut off certain people from my life, even though they're toxic, because they could turn out to be good. Who am I to say they will never become better people? Eventually, at some point, you reach a certain age where you start realizing that is just the kind of optimism about human nature that is not warranted. There are people who simply will troll you for the heck of it, and there is no common ground to be reached, and there is nothing valuable to ever be learned, and there is nothing you will ever accomplish by debating them. You do not, in fact, need to keep them in your circle. You do not need to suffer their Facebook posts. You can just block them. You can, in fact, just cut them off, and it's okay. So that paralysis you talk about from making a choice, I think is very real, but I think it tends to be the kind of concern you have when you're young, meaning you still believe that you have infinite time in the universe to fix some of these things and make things better. But when you're older, at some age, you will make the decision that no, you know who you are and you're not going to change, and these people know who they are and they're not going to change. I mean, it's like sort of when I go to college reunions, I go to the college reunion, it's been decades since I saw some of these people. We start talking, and I realize this is why I didn't like you in college. I still don't like you. And you know what? I will just not talk to you anymore because we're too old for this. So at some point, choice just becomes easier to you simply because mortality forces you to value what little time is left to you more than this potential of impossible connectedness.
I wrote a whole book about people who will never stop trolling you, so they're definitely out there. Yeah.
Hi. You talked a little about this, but I was wondering if you could talk about the similarities and differences working with novels and short story formats, because you've done both in like very extreme ends, right? Like huge, massive novels and very short stories.
Right. So in retrospect, I can manufacture some narrative about why it made total sense that I worked in the short form and the long form and jump between, and how they're all each uniquely suited to whatever story I wanted to tell. I will not tell you that story. The reality is I wrote a lot of flash fiction because after my daughter was born, I had very little time to stay focused. My brain was incapable of focusing on anything longer than a flash piece of fiction. So for a long time, I wrote just flash pieces because that was all my daughter allowed me to do. So that's the story. And when it came time to writing long novels, it was because I wanted to write when my daughter was old enough that I could now focus on things that are a little bit longer. And in terms of how they're different, they really are actually very different. The way I talk about it is I make an analogy between a mosquito and an elephant. And I say that you cannot actually take a mosquito and scale it up to the size of an elephant and expect that creature to live. It will not. For many reasons, among which is the fact that surface area increases much slower than internal mass, and a passively respiring creature like an insect body plan will not support that size creature. In fact, as a tangent, this is why during the Carboniferous period you had much larger insects. One theory is that the oxygen content was so much higher that you could actually support a larger maximum size for insects who don't have an active respiratory system. Anyway, that aside, the point is this. Insects and elephants work on very different body plans, and they maintain their life force or their narrative tension or their drive or the way they hold their readers' interest in very different ways. In a short story, I can get away with all sorts of things. I mean, I can do that cutting thing, a story told by cutting away pieces. I can do things like telling a story with no character and plot, like the bookmaking habits of select species. I do not think I can even entertain myself writing a novel that way. I think I would actually start to want to choke myself at some point if I tried to do that. A novel just has a very different kind of demand for breathing, for the need to get air in there, to get narrative tension, to get plot, to get drive in there. And that was something I had to learn. Because I wrote so many short stories and I was very good at just winging it and not bothering about plot. When it came time to write a novel, I had to relearn how to do plotting and actually reteach myself all the things that I loved about old novels that I enjoyed and modern novels as well, and see how writers actually create narrative tension. And then once I figure that out, try to apply it to my novel. But no, they are very different things. And you can't just scale up a short story and think that you have a novel. I think they function on very different fundamental aesthetic principles.
So you've also done a significant amount of translation work. Big fan of the 2 books you translated in the 3 Body Problem series. And I was curious what, I guess, excites you most about doing translation work, especially Chinese science fiction.
Well, I would like to give you an awesome answer that talks about my dedication to the art of translation and so on and so forth, but I can't, because that wouldn't be true. The reason I do translations is because I wanted to help my friends. One does a lot of things to help their friends, and that's basically me. I had zero interest in translations. I had no expertise. I never thought in my life I would ever want to do translations. It seemed like completely not my thing. That's not the same as saying it's actually easy to do. It's incredibly hard. So for those of you who are actually dedicated translators, you are like those, master performing artists. It's just that I happen to like to compose rather than performing. It's just, I want to compose music. I just don't want to play someone else's music. So I got into translation solely because I love these stories I read by my friends in China. And one of the key ethical principles that we hold dear in the worldwide fandom community is that we should perform service. How I mentioned earlier that we learn values by stories. And so some of us in fandom perform service by running conventions. I mean, being a con runner is very, very hard work, and you get very little thanks for it. Some of us do it by teaching or running websites in which writers could come together to exchange tips. Again, thankless work, but critical to community building. And I was like, well, I need to find some way to do community service and to make everything better. And to me, the thing that I could do that no one else at the time seemed to be able to do was to bring these stories from my friends to an audience they couldn't otherwise reach. So I forced myself to learn translation and to learn all the performing techniques that I had no interest in. And this is hard stuff. I had to apprentice myself and learn it and fail many times before I felt like I learned enough to be able to do justice to the sort of work that my friends were doing. And then, I did it. So 2 things have made me super happy as a result. One is now there are so many more people who are qualified to be translators and who are good at it to do this now, so that I don't feel like I need to keep on doing it. And number 2, I feel really proud of the fact that I was able to play a very tiny role in the fact that a couple of my friends have been able to get worldwide recognition for their work. That makes me so happy. Like, how many of us can say that, we do things for our friends and it actually end up helping them for real, like actually worked. So I'm pretty happy that the way I chose to help out actually ended up being helpful.
Thank you so much for coming. And my question is less about writing, more like your career choice, I guess. And you said that we're always our own epic fantasy. And when a reader goes into your Wikipedia page or learns about you, and the first thing they see is you have an impressive, resume, careers in computer science, law, English, literature, and everything. How did you make those early career choices? Did you always know that you're gonna write sci-fi, for example, and did you think that you would use them in your novel writing, and or were they just for just why did you make those choices, and how would you advise aspiring writers?
Okay, so awesome question. But let me start by saying that Wikipedia is the one narrative about you that you have no control over. So whatever you read on Wikipedia about me, I'm just gonna say there's some truth to it, but don't believe everything you read out there. All right, so here's the thing. What you're referring to is the fact that I had basically an aimless career. That's to put it better. So I started out as an English major, but I did not go to grad school. I went to work for Microsoft as an engineer. I didn't stay there very long because my friends were saying, come on back, we're doing startups. And my girlfriend at the time was here, so in Cambridge. So I returned to Cambridge and joined a startup. And I was a pretty good engineer. I loved it, but I didn't stick with that. I ended up as a corporate lawyer and did that for a few years. And then I switched over to being a litigation consultant, where I advise lawyers working on patent cases how to understand the technology. I read the source code and tell them, how does this map to the patent and how does it not, and how can we prove the other side's expert is an idiot and I am smart. Things like that. So if you put it that way, it seems like a sequence of random choices with no goal or rhyme or reason at all. And you would not be entirely wrong. But here's how I make sense of it in retrospect. Basically, I was very good at all of these careers that I chose. I mean, I can say that. I won awards for all of these things and got all kinds of promotions, and I was good at it. But there was always some sense in which I felt unsatisfied in pursuing each of these careers. And it's only much later that I figured out that I just wasn't actually doing something out of my own intrinsic love for it. I was doing all of these things out of an extrinsic fear of not being able to make it. So all of us have this experience, no doubt, especially if you go to good schools, and you have this terror of not being able to hold up your head at reunions and saying that I'm doing this, and people will look at you and say, "That's all you ended up doing? What a waste!" So a lot of us are driven to pursue career choices out of fear. We are afraid that we would not be successful, that we're afraid that we'll be considered less than what we should be. We're afraid that we will not bring honor to our great alma mater who sends us letters to beg for more money. And again, at some point when you get older, you suddenly realize living out of fear is a terrible way to live. And living out of love is much better. I became a full-time writer because it's something I intrinsically love to do. I intrinsically wanted to do it. It was nice that I won all sorts of awards and get flown around the world to attend literary festivals. But even if none of that happened, I was still right because I did it for 20-some years while I was pursuing all these other careers. So in the end, I just sort of gave in and said, this is what I intrinsically love to do. Why don't I just do it? And I'm privileged enough to have saved enough money that I can actually try it and not worry about starving children. And I'm very lucky that so far it has worked out, that I've been able to actually make this work as a full-time career. And how many of us can say that we're doing something intrinsically we love, that we would do even if we weren't being paid for it? And we are actually being paid for it and making a living. So I feel like I'm incredibly lucky, largely thanks to my readers like you. I really do treasure it. I try to tell the best stories I know how, and I try to send a message of hope that feels to me sincere, and I feel bound to share my feelings and what I've learned about the world, because not many of us get to do this, and I feel very blessed, and I want to celebrate our love of good storytelling and stories with everyone.
Yeah, let's celebrate. Give it up. Thanks, guys. Ken's going to be signing books, so make sure you check that out.
So if you are planning on getting a book signed, I'm going to ask you to line up directly in front of the speaker, going straight back to the end of the room. If you haven't purchased a book yet, we have both Ken's and Andrew's books for sale at the register, so please feel free to head over there. Thank you.